In the previous video, we looked at the justified true belief analysis of knowledge, the JTB analysis of knowledge. And we saw that while truth, belief and justification might all be necessary for knowledge, they didn't seem to be jointly sufficient, because we could come up with counterexamples such that they fitted the JTB analysis. There was justified true belief, but they weren't knowledge. So I look at the clock, it's 2 o'clock, or it seems to be 2 o'clock, it is 2 o'clock, I believe that it's 2 o'clock, that's justified true belief, but what if the clock isn't actually working, and I happen to be super lucky to look at it just at the moment when it's showing me the right time, right? It's standing still at 2 o'clock, and I just happen to look at it at 2 o'clock. That seems to be justified true belief, that is not knowledge. Or I looked at, I took a brief glance at this field I was driving past, and what I saw seemed to me a white sheep, and so I believe that there's a white sheep in that field there. What I actually saw was a cunning cardboard cutout of a sheep. It was very well done, so it really seemed like a sheep to me. I was blameless in believing that there was a sheep there. And there actually was a sheep there, behind the cardboard cutout. But of course I didn't see that real sheep. And so it seems that although I have a justified true belief that there's a sheep in the field, it doesn't seem to be knowledge, right? There's just too much luck involved. I didn't actually really see the real sheep, and so on. Or the third example that I mentioned, suppose that I put a half-full carton of milk in the fridge this morning, and that's why I believe that there's milk in the fridge. But my wife drank all of it, and then just a couple of minutes ago she went to the shop and bought a new carton of milk and put that in the fridge. And so there actually is a carton of milk in the fridge, but a lot of things happened that I didn't know about, and we might not want to say that I know it, right? I mean, if my wife had gone to the shop a little bit later, then there wouldn't be a carton of milk in the fridge. It seems that I'm too lucky here, in a sense, right? I mean, it seems that I just don't have a good enough grasp of the situation for it to count as knowledge. Now, what philosophers tried to do once these kinds of counterexamples became apparent is they tried to fix or change the justified true belief analysis of knowledge in such a way that it would give the right answers in these kinds of examples. Now, there are roughly 2 ways you can try to do this. The first way is you can try to add something to the justified true belief. So you're going to say, well, knowledge is as knows that P if and only if it's a justified true belief and X, where X is some extra condition. Or you could say, maybe there's something wrong with the J, the T, or the B. Mostly people try to say that there's something wrong with the J, maybe we don't need justification, but something else. And they try to put something else in its place, hoping that that would fix the problem. So, what I want to do is I want to take a brief look at some of these proposed solutions. And what I want is I want to... I don't want to take an exhaustive look because so much has been written about this. There are so many analyses and examples and counterexamples and so on and so forth. I mean, we could do 20 videos about that, no problem. I don't want to do that. I want to take a brief look at some of these attempts with a focus on method. I mean, what do people try and where does it go wrong and what does that teach us? Right? So that's what I want to do. And I'm going to start with, let's think about this. Somebody comes with the counterexample where they say, oh, but you sometimes get a justified true belief by looking at a clock that has stopped. And surely that is a knowledge. So what I could do is I could add something to the JTB analysis. Namely, I could say, okay, in order for S to know that P, we have to have that S believes that P is true, that S is justified in believing that P, and that this is not a case of trying to find out how late it is by looking at a clock that has stopped. I could do that and it would get rid of this counterexample. But it's not a philosophically very good move. Why not? Well, because the thing that I'm adding here is way too specific. Right? It's way too specific. I mean, that's not what our concept of knowledge is. right? Our concept of knowledge is not justified true belief. That is not an attempt to use a clock that has stopped in order to find out about the time, right? That can't be a serious analysis of knowledge. So if we add something or change something about this JTB analysis, we want it to be general. We want it to be plausible that this is part of our concept of knowledge. We want it to have a certain level of abstraction and philosophical sophistication. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. Okay. And of course, we would like it most of all to be sort of one thing, or maybe two things, but like not a lot of things, that get rid of all these counterexamples for us, right? We don't want to be a sort of ever lengthening list of things that we need to add in order to get rid of an ever lengthening list of more and more elaborate counterexamples. So here's something we could try. Let's think about the sheep example. Right? What is so strange about the sheep example is that I didn't actually see the sheep. And maybe that's where something is going wrong. And so maybe, here's something that people have tried. Maybe what you want to say is that you can only have knowledge of a proposition if there has been a causal relation between the stuff in the world that makes the proposition true and your belief. Right? If the stuff in the world that makes the proposition true actually caused your belief. Now, the stuff in the world that makes the proposition true, there's a sheep in the field, is that sheep in the field, which I didn't even see, right? There is no causal relation. And so if I add this condition, if I say there has to be a causal relation between what makes your belief true and you having the belief, great, I'm going to get rid of this counterexample. So is that a good addition? Well, there are a couple of reasons to be worried that maybe it's not a very good addition. Now, one type of worry might be that it doesn't get rid of enough stuff, right? It doesn't get rid of all the problems, so it might be too specific. For instance, it doesn't really seem to be getting rid of the clock example, because there definitely was a causal relation between the clock and me. Okay. But maybe that's not what's important. What's important is that there ought to be a causal relation between the fact that it's 2 o'clock and my belief. But that's a little bit weird. I mean, what is it to have a causal relation with the fact? It's very hard to apply this causal criterion to this example of the clock. So it might be the case that it doesn't get rid of everything that we want to get rid of. Here's another way, right? We could even just take the sheep example and tweak it a little bit, and suddenly it fits even this new analysis of knowledge. So suppose that my cardboard cutout of a sheep is leaning against the sheep, right? And if the sheep had gone away, the cardboard cutout would have fallen down, and I wouldn't have seen it, right? Suppose that that's the situation. Well, now the sheep plays an important causal role in my observation, right? Without the sheep, I wouldn't have seen the cardboard cutout. And so the sheep does play an important causal role. And this new example fits my analysis, even though I still don't see the sheep, right? And it still shouldn't count as knowledge. Okay. So, that doesn't really seem to work. And then on the other hand, I mean, it doesn't get rid of enough things. But on the other hand, it also maybe gets rid of too many things. Because it also seems to be the case that I know certain facts that I have no causal relation to. Right? If I know what the time is, I don't really seem to have a causal relation to the time. Or if I know that 2 plus 3 is 5, I don't seem to have any causal relation to mathematical numbers. I mean, what does that even mean, right? So this causal condition, it might be too weak. It doesn't get rid of all the counterexamples, not even all the counterexamples about sheep in fields with cardboard cutouts. And it also seems too strong. It gets rid of certain knowledge that I have. Like it gets rid of knowledge about mathematics, for instance. And so this doesn't really seem to work. Okay, maybe the problem was that I didn't see the sheep, right? And you can only have knowledge if you see the thing. Well, okay, so that seems, again, implausibly strong. I mean, sure, if I see something, I know it. I mean, that's sort of part of the well, maybe that's not even that is true. But if I see something and I have good reasons to believe it, maybe then I know it. That's kind of plausible. But of course, I know a lot of things that I don't see, right? I mean, I know that Amsterdam is the capital of the Netherlands, but I don't see that Amsterdam is the capital of the Netherlands. I'm miles away from Amsterdam. I don't even really know how you would see such a thing. So observation as a criterion for knowledge would also seem to be just too strong. Okay, so here we see a familiar problem or dialectic playing out, right? You have a counterexample. You can think of a way to fix it, but the fix might be too weak because very related counterexamples are not excluded, or it might be too strong. It's suddenly excluding all kinds of things that you don't want excluded. That is very typical. It happens all the time in these debates about analyses of knowledge and in debates about analyses of other things. So, I think this causal relation or this observation-like condition, those are good examples of problems you might run into when you try to just add more conditions. And of course you can try to keep adding conditions and keep tweaking them. But it turns out that with some ingenuity, philosophers have been really good at continuing to find counterexamples. Maybe you want to try another track and you want to just ditch JTB for something else. Now, by far the most famous attempt to do that in contemporary epistemology is a theory called reliabilism. And reliabilism tells us to not worry too much about this justification thing, right? The having of good reasons. That's sort of maybe too subjective or internal or something like that. What we should be worrying about is whether something was generated by a reliable method, whether the belief was generated by a reliable method. So if I get my belief from a reliable method, and here reliable means that it usually leads to the truth. If I got my belief from a reliable method, a method that usually leads to the truth, then it's knowledge. If it's true and I got it from, so we have a reliable true belief analysis of knowledge, right? I mean, in order to be knowledge, I've got to believe it, it's got to be true, and it's got to be the product of a reliable method. And so the hope would be that if I do something like that, right, and so observation is maybe a reliable method, that's nice, whereas just believing the first thing that comes into my mind is probably not a reliable method, so that's nice too, right? I mean, this has some intuitive plausibility. And so the hope would be that in these counterexamples, reliabilism, the idea of a reliable method, works better than justification. So maybe I look at this clock that has stopped, but I don't know that it has stopped, right? And that's why I'm still justified in believing what the clock says. Okay, says the reliabilist, yeah, you're still justified, but it's not a reliable method, right? Looking at a clock that has stopped is not a reliable method of finding out the time. And so, the reliabilist might want to say, in the case of the clock that has stopped, the justified true belief analysis fails because, yeah, you're justified in believing that it's 2 o'clock. But the reliabilist analysis succeeds because reliabilism correctly points out that since you are not using a reliable method, looking at a stopped clock is not a reliable method. Since you're not using a reliable method, it shouldn't count as knowledge. And we don't want to count it as knowledge, and so reliabilism has a win. And that would be sort of fine, except for the fact that when we start thinking about how to use this reliabilist criterion, things become a lot less clear. So here we see another type of problem coming up. It's maybe also the case that reliabilism is perhaps too permissive or too strict, but a third problem, and the one that I want to focus on that we didn't see beforehand, is that reliabilism might be too vague, right? It's without further explanation, it's not clear what should count as the method that I have used. And if it's not clear what method I have used, then it's not going to be not clear whether it's reliable or not. Because there are at least 3 ways to describe the method that I have used. right? I have looked at the clock in order to find out the time. Well, that's a pretty reliable method. I have looked at a clock that has stopped in order to find out the time. Okay, that's not a very reliable method. Third possibility, I have looked at a clock that has stopped at the exact moment that it's showing the right time in order to find out about the time. Well, that is a very reliable method, right? I mean, if you look at the clock that has stopped at the exact time it shows the right time, you're going to find out the right time. I mean, that's super reliable. So which of these methods is the one that I've used? I mean, there's a sense in which I've used all of them. If you ask me which I've used, I say, well, I looked at the clock. If you ask my critic which one I've used, they say, well, he looked at a clock that stopped. But it's very hard to see how to even analyze this situation, right? And depending on what we choose, it seems to count as knowledge or not knowledge, and so it seems to be right or wrong. And this is a problem that sort of haunts reliabilism. I mean, there are certain cases where it works pretty well, but it turns out to be really hard to clarify what exactly we mean with a reliable method. Okay. There are other cases where I suppose that reliabilism is just not going to weed out the counterexamples anyway, right? So remembering what I put in the fridge this morning, that's a pretty reliable method of, finding out what is in the fridge right now. That usually works. That works 99.9% of the time. Didn't work in my milk example. Yeah. If you want to come up with counterexamples against reliabilism, it's going to work. There are counterexamples. If reliabilists try to patch up their reliabilism with more conditions, then just like with JTB, all you need is a philosopher who sits down and thinks for a while and comes up with a new counterexample that works against this more complicated analysis. And that is something that you actually see in the literature. You see that more and more sophisticated analyses are developed to deal with more and more counterexamples, but then there's always some kind of new counterexample. And there's a famous article by Linda Zagzabski, The Inescapability of Gettier Problems, in which she argues that this is what we should expect. Right? We should expect that it's always possible to come up with another counterexample against whatever the newest, latest, most sophisticated analysis of knowledge is supposed to be. Well, where does that leave us as epistemologists? Right? I mean, well, a couple of things that we could try to do. But one thing is we could say, okay, we're just going to accept one of these analyses, even though it has counterexamples, because we think it's good enough. I mean, who cares about all those counterexamples? If it works most of the time, that's good enough for us. And maybe that's right. It's also a little bit disappointing because very often these counterexamples are really sort of clear cases, right? I mean, it's really very intuitive to say that, yeah, I mean, this is not really knowledge, or yeah, this is really knowledge, and the analysis doesn't say the correct thing about it. So maybe it's what we ought to do, right? Just say good enough is good enough, but it's a little bit disappointing. Something else that we could do is we could say, well, this analysis is just right. And if your intuition says something else, you'd better change your intuitions. You could double down on an analysis and do that, right? Tell people to change their pre-existing ideas about what counts as knowledge and what doesn't count as knowledge. And that's an interesting option too, although of course different philosophers are going to pick different analyses to double down on, and so they're going to end up massively disagreeing, and they're not going to end up revising their intuitions as the other philosopher wants them to do. And so this, it's a little bit disappointing too. A third, also, I would say relatively popular option is to keep trying, right? I mean, to say, well, we haven't found the right analysis of knowledge yet, but fingers crossed, maybe we will one day. And why not? I mean, keeping hope, that's certainly an option. But philosophers also like a fourth option, and the fourth option is to say, well, maybe there's something wrong with this project, right? Maybe there's something wrong with trying to find an analysis of knowledge. And I suppose that the most famous way of doing that in contemporary epistemology, which has been pretty popular for the last 20 years or so, is to say, well, maybe knowledge is the most fundamental concept here, right? Maybe we shouldn't try to say knowledge is justified, true, belief, and some other things. Maybe we should say, look, the most fundamental concept that we have here is knowledge, and now we should try to analyze these other concepts in terms of knowledge, right? Maybe that works better. And this approach is usually called knowledge-first epistemology, because it puts knowledge first, not in the sense of that it's the most important thing or the most valuable thing, although they might believe that too, but that it's where we start our analyses, right? I mean, knowledge is the concept that we already know and understand, and now we're going to try to explain belief and truth maybe and so on in terms of knowledge. And that's certainly something you can try. And actually knowledge-first epistemology is quite interesting. I'm not going to discuss it, at least I'm not planning to discuss it in this series of lectures, but who knows, maybe I'll do so in some future era when I have time to add to the course that I'm making right now. So that's what I wanted to say about these analyses of knowledge. Right, I'm going to leave you sort of in the pit of despair, maybe a little bit, where we don't really have a good analysis of knowledge. But I think it's useful to see how this kind of debate works, what we're after when we try to give an analysis, what the kind of trouble is that we run into, how we can try to fix that trouble, and if it doesn't work, if we can't fix the trouble, what the options on the table are. And so I hope that it's been useful not only as an introduction to these analyses of knowledge, but also as an introduction to philosophical method, to one very important part of philosophical method as philosophy is practiced today.